In today's session, we are going to be talking about how you can protect your law firm's reputation with DLP, that's data loss prevention technologies, ultimately how you can protect your data from loss. Really delighted and grateful to be joined today by Chris Roney, a data security specialist here at CoSoSys, and also by Daryl Craig, a Director of Information Technology. I will let actually Daryl give a quick sort of 20-second intro into himself. I think Daryl's got some really valuable experience that's going to be very meaningful for today's session. I can also actually see on today's session, we've also got some of our existing customers joining, which is fantastic. So hopefully there'll be something for everybody here today, some new ideas, some new use cases, and how you can think about protecting your firm's data. So Daryl, maybe I could just ask you to give us sorry to put you on the spot so soon. Maybe I can ask you to give a quick 20-second introduction.
Sure, great, thank you. So I'm the Director of Information Technology at Linder Slatt, which is a Canadian premier litigation law firm. I've been in legal IT for about 25 years, so I've seen quite the evolution of the IT role and how DLP has played a part in that. So I'm hoping to share some of my experience with that with all of you today.
Perfect. Great to have you here. And Chris, how about yourself? I don't want you to feel left out. Maybe you can give us a brief intro.
I'm Chris Roney. I've been with CoSoSys for about almost 2 years now, and I've been in the information, data security, and data analytics space for about 7 years total before that. So helping with architecture and data-related things for companies for a while. Perfect.
For those of you that aren't familiar with CoSoSys and our product Endpoint Protector, let me just give you a quick 30-second elevator pitch before we get into the meat of today's topic. We are a global leader in data loss prevention tools, as well as servicing the legal industry. We look after a number of what we would define as professional services, highly regulated industries where the need to protect data is important. Chris, I know you sort of specialize and work quite a lot with law firms, particularly out of North America. Maybe you can share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so law firms is a strength of ours. It's not the only focus, but it's one of our sort of core focuses. One sort of bit to brag about is we are in about we are in 6 of the 10 largest law firms in the United States. So that's something that we can boast about. If it gets a little higher than that, we probably will have to stop making that claim, because if it gets to 10 out of 10, then everyone will know that they have our DLP software, and we can't really be telling people that ahead of time. That's kind of against the nature of security. You want to have a little bit of privacy from that standpoint, but we can still say that now. But yeah, we have a lot of experience with that. And, some DLPs, tools are different than other ones, and some work better with law firms, and ours is one of those tools.
Great. So listen, we've thrown around this term, right? Data loss prevention, or DLP. I'm sure for the majority of people on this call, they are familiar with that technology and what it does, but let's not make an assumption. I think it's important to have a bit of a definition. And interestingly, I'm going to throw this over to you, Chris, because you have what I think is a great real world definition, right? There's a lot of, if you search up the term online, you'll get multiple different sort of definitions. You'll get lost in words. And I think you have a really great sort of quick view on what it really means and why it's important, particularly for this profession. So go for it.
Yeah, I kind of like to cut straight through all the ambiguity and confusion. And the reason I do this is I've had conversations with people who've been security experts for 10 years, sometimes longer. And they go, yeah, I know what DLP is. It's data loss prevention. And then they go on to define what it is. And it's actually not exactly the spirit of it. So DLP stands for data loss prevention. What does that mean? Well, to me, that means nothing and everything all at the same time. Well, I don't want to lose my data. No one wants to lose their data. You don't want to lose it or drop it somewhere. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it's ambiguous. And what I realized after doing this for a while is that it's ambiguous by design. It's intentional, because a DLP, or the acronym DLP, is a euphemism. It's a euphemism to say something in a nice way that isn't so nice. So the thing that isn't so nice is that it's software to protect companies from their employees. Now, nobody wants to call it that. Vendors don't make that their bumper sticker or their tagline. And when companies roll this out to their whole company, they announce it. They don't say, hey, we don't trust anybody. Now we're going to go spy on you. Nobody wants to call it that. So they all kind of agreed on something more delicate and nice, which is called data loss prevention. And for the most part, people have no idea what that means. And that's sort of by design.
That's great. Daryl, anything to add on that? Does that feel like a fair assessment or a little bit harsh?
No, it's a very fair assessment. So, I mean, our clients and all clients of any law firm now are very worried about where their data is going, and they want to know if a lateral associate is going to take data with them or not, and if not block it, they want to at least know what went out and when and how.
Mm. I think that's important, right? Because this isn't news to anybody. The amount of data that we handle in our business has just grown exponentially over the years. But I think we have to acknowledge as professionals that so too have the risks, right? The risks to all of that data, much of which can be classed as sensitive or confidential. And I think, to Chris's earlier point, nobody wants to lose their data. Nobody wants to be compromised. But I think there are some sectors, some industries that are probably, I don't want to say exposed, but yes, exposed as a brand more than others. And I think, the loss of client information or company IP has an absolutely devastating impact on any sector that has confidentiality at the heart of its business. So I think the legal profession, accountancy firms, these types of organizations. Chris, talking to sort of law firms as you do you see sort of any sort of unique differences in terms of the culture or how perhaps law firms think about data security?
Law firms are completely different than every other industry. And I say that in the nicest possible way. If you're an IT person on this call, you might be shaking your head like Daryl is. No, you're not unique. It's not just you that think that. I think that too. And I talk to every industry. So law firms are very unique. They are filled with lawyers, obviously, and lawyers have different expectations of privacy, different expectations of trust and flexibility and the ability to do things. And the other thing is, and even if you do trust everyone in your law firm, it could be that your clients don't know Steve from Joe. They don't know the people in your law firm. They don't know that they're trustworthy. So even though some law firms might be, apprehensive to do that, they might even think it's invasive. Sometimes just culturally, they have to have it to have that peace of mind for their clients as well. So we'll get more into this later on. We've got a topic that covers this in more depth, but I do like to kind of touch on that, at least at the very beginning, kind of set the stage, because law firms are special. They are unique. It's not just you that thinks that. I think that too. And they're pretty much different than every other industry that we deal with from a DLP standpoint. And there's a lot of reasons for that we'll get into.
Daryl, do you think the sort of awareness of data security has sort of grown in the sector? And by that, I mean, is it a board level item for discussion now? Yeah,
it's something our management, if you asked me 5 years ago, our management committee wouldn't even, they might have heard DLP, but they had no idea what it was. But as we get new pitches from clients, potential clients, even existing clients are now asking for cybersecurity audits. They're now asking, do you have DLP? And they're not just saying, do you have DLP? They're getting very sophisticated. Do you have the particular functions and features turned on? And that's really, really important to them. And there was a lot of resistance, as you say, because part of the professional conduct is to trust each other and keep everything confidential. And so it was a massive mind shift for the lawyers to go through. But the one thing, how I sell anything like this is when the clients ask for it, the clients get it. So I had to help the management committee or the board, depending on how your firm is structured, to accept this culture shift. And you need the board on board to promote such a change in culture, because it is a huge cultural change. Law firms are unique, as Chris said.
And I think, I think one of the other things, right, to think about, and I have this discussion a lot with people when I talk about data protection and how we secure sensitive information. And I'm always very keen to use that word information, right, rather than files, because I think often when we think about protecting our data, we naturally just think about files and losing files. I don't think that's the case anymore, right? It's about where different pockets of data live, how that data is shared across different applications. The sheer amount of applications that we have in our daily lives now that we're using on our laptops just means it's the flow of information. It's a very frictionless experience to start sharing all of that information. So I think now, when I think about this and I talk about it, I think less about the actual data, and I think more about what I call these exit points, right? So whether it's an email attachment, or it's a file that's been saved locally to my PC, or it's something that I've saved to an external drive, or it's even as a piece of content that I share in a message, right? I'm using Slack or I'm using Microsoft Teams, and I'm just cutting and pasting some information out of a file and I'm sharing it with a geographically dispersed team. Or maybe I've just printed it. These are all these exit points, I guess, for data. I mean, I know, Daryl, how do you, I mean, I guess you and your firm, you're using some of these tools, right? Collaboration tools that we're arming all of our employees with. You're using these. Have you thought about the security implications of those in your data?
Absolutely. I mean, like many Toronto law firms, when the pandemic hit, accelerated the rollout of MS Teams. It's one of the common standards for the Toronto law firms here now. And many other organizations and law firms, luckily we were ahead of the curve, didn't have a DLP that could actually monitor the data that happened in Microsoft Teams, especially when it went to a mobile device or anything else like that. And our systems just weren't designed to secure Teams. We also have ethical screens that we need to adhere to, as well as DLP. So we've seen it a lot in a lot of my cousin law firms, and it's definitely a hot topic right now on how to manage the data in there, because it's going there now instead of just emailing a document back and forth where a DLP might have already been in place. But how do you handle that when it's in Teams or anything? I mean, that's just one example of many collaboration tools.
So it's not just it's not just a black and white. Here is the type of data that you can share on these applications. I mean, there's a lot of these sort of gray areas, as you say, those ethical screens, right? You may have multiple people working on different client projects, but in the same channel, right? And often, I guess, they're not aware of that, right? They're not aware of who else is in that channel and the information they're sharing. They may feel it's appropriate, right? They've gone through their security training and they feel it's okay for us to share this without necessarily realizing those sort of grayer areas in terms of those sort of ethical screens that you mentioned. Chris, any other sort of exit points that you can think of? I know we're going to cover printing later on, because I think that's pretty unique. Well, not unique. Everyone prints, every industry prints, but the legal industry still does like a paper version, right?
Yeah, it's also unique from a DLP standpoint. It might be the most unique when it comes to DLP, and also the trickiest. So yeah, we'll get into that more later. But one thing I want to add to this is, you mentioned, the key that you mentioned is the exit points. And I think the world is kind of changing when it comes to DLP, and DLP is a part of this. And when people usually talk or think about when it comes to sensitive data, they think, where does the sensitive data live? That's not the right question to ask. The question isn't, where does my sensitive data live? The question is, if my sensitive data were to go somewhere, how would it get there? What are the exit points? Because we're generally not concerned that there's data living on servers. Data is supposed to live on servers because servers are secure. If you didn't want it there, you would have destroyed it or deleted it. So now we're in sort of a new sort of paradigm of security where you have to keep this data so that your attorneys or your employees can access it while still controlling the exit points. So security's moved from where it's stored to how it goes places. And the exit points are the way to think about DLP when it comes to this, and not so much where that data lives.
Got it. That's a really great point. So we've got this idea that the goal of DLP is to protect a firm from data loss, protect it from employees or outside threats, and it's really about giving IT admins the control that they need to protect their firm. The question is, right, who's the real threat? And I think actually we've answered this. We've kind of given it away by your definition of DLP, Chris, but I think it's still worth sort of covering, because there is this real perception, right? I think if you were to speak to people who aren't necessarily in our sort of sector and say, well, who is the real threat? Their perception would have been shaped by the media, and they'll think it's some cloaked figure in a dark room trying to infiltrate and hack our networks. And that's really not the case, right? More than 50% of data breaches are still caused by employee negligence, right? Whether it be lost USBs or they're misdirected emails or they're using IT applications that, people like Daryl would rather they didn't within the organization. And, I think, again, Chris, when people are coming to you and talking to you about protecting their data, I guess they understand this, right? They do understand that it's employees and not external threats that are sort of principle in this. And we're not saying that all of these threats, insider threats, are malicious. I'm sure those do happen, right? There are malicious attempts from insiders, but a lot of it is just negligence, right?
Yeah, and that's one thing maybe I didn't expand initially when I gave my definition, is not all things are nefarious intentionally. It could be accidental. And some estimates, the majority of those events are actually accidental. It's very hard to get really good data on that. We've got data that says more than 50% are caused by, insider breaches. That number might even be a lot higher, but it's hard to know. And from a news versus reality standpoint, I'm in a very unique position where I get to see both sides, right? So obviously we sign NDAs and, I would never go into details, but, sometimes companies come to us and say, hey, we had this thing that happened. We had this breach. Here's exactly what happened. Can you make sure this never happens again? And I get to see all these things. And then a month later, that company will be on the news and it'll be, portrayed in a much different light. And a lot of times the news, when something hits a news cycle, it shows up as sort of an outsider or a hack or some sort of malicious actor did it. And, the specificity of it is lost in that. And in reality, a lot of times it's an employee was careless with the USB drive, or maybe they were disgruntled and they went somewhere else, or they were just upset and they moved things. So the news does not meet the reality. According to the news, you'd think it's mostly outside hackers from other countries, but it's not. And the reality of the situation is a lot of things are insiders. We have to remember when things are inside breach, that's very embarrassing for a company, as you can imagine. So the stories don't always line up.
I will just pause here to remind everybody that's joined the session. We are getting questions through, which is amazing. Thank you. We'll have some time at the end to answer those. If you hadn't seen it, please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of this webinar, and you can submit your questions. I forgot to mention that at the top of the webinar. We're going to look at some of those key challenges to the legal profession, some of the things that, as you both agreed, make the legal profession pretty unique, and then sort of wrap up with some best practices and ideas around how you can get the most out of DLP. But I just want to cover the different types of data, the different types of threats, because again, when we talk about data protection, what actually are we trying to protect, right? How do we decide what is worth protecting, what is just standard day-to-day business? I categorize it in three different ways, and guys, please agree or disagree or share as you see fit. I think number one, right, is confidential client data, right? As I said earlier, any industry that relies on trust and confidentiality is at high risk, right? Because a breach that involves client confidential information, it's not only gonna damage the immediate client relationship you have, but it's also going to result in some significant reputational damage. And I think one of the challenges there, and I don't know, how perhaps Daryl, how you handle it, is that a lot of client confidential data is typically unstructured, right? It's very easy if I'm a bank to say, well, I need to protect credit card numbers. I need to protect social security numbers. I know the syntax and the format of those, right? But when we're talking about client data, it can be pretty unstructured. So I guess you're looking at some kind of meta tagging for this, right?
Yeah. So and different clients have different expectations for DLP. So, and you're right, we're dealing with that personal identified information, and so we need to be allowed to forward it around. Now, luckily at my firm, we use a document management system where we enforce, but educate why we enforce everything saved into our document management system. So it's structured, at least in the sense, by client in a matter, so we can give different rules. But yes, we do put a different meta tags so that we can say this particular document has different information and treat it differently than a generic document. So you're absolutely right in that part.
I guess the second category would be PII, personal identifiable information. And a lot of organizations say to me, well, we don't really handle PII, right? We're not a bank. We're not an insurance company. We don't hold, customer information on mass at scale like that. And I said, well, listen, every organization does, right? Even if it's your own employees, you have a legal obligation, data protection regulations to handle, not only client, but even employee PII data. You have a duty of care to do that, right? And that includes remaining accountable for PII that you might transfer to third parties. And that is the sort of information in highly pressured environments. It's very easy to find sort of shortcuts and share that information on email and other applications. The final one, the final classification, I think this is often forgotten about. I'm quite passionate about talking about this because I think people don't necessarily consider it sensitive information, and that's your company IP. Right, working in businesses and organizations, you've worked really hard to differentiate yourselves, right? And you've got IP, whether it's employee training guides, how we onboard clients, the processes that we use, and it's that IP that's associated directly with your profitability. And often that's the type of content and data that's at risk from leavers. Right, people leaving a business, right? They'll suck up some presentations, some information, some client contact details, or some financial reports, and they'll pop it on a USB drive and take it with them. So, client confidential info, PII, and company IP. I think that kind of is, in its broadest term, covers everything, guys. Would you agree, or is there any others that I've perhaps missed?
I think that's it.
Perfect. Right, let's jump into, I think, a really great part of this session, which is going to be, the question: are law firms unique in their data security challenge? You both agreed earlier on that law firms, the legal industry, is completely unique, unlike any others in their approach. So let's take this as an example, right? There is zero tolerance for those ultra restrictive zero trust policies, right? We're not working in an industry where even a 30-minute delay in accessing information if we've got a court date is acceptable, right? So I don't know, let me start with Chris. Maybe you could talk to some of this.
Yeah, and this kind of goes into the culture of it. The culture is very different. So there's a lot of things that are different with lawyers, right? One is that they don't like it if you don't immediately trust them to do something that's the right thing to do. So there's sort of a cultural thing there to deal with, and not having a zero trust environment is something that is, sort of, I guess, kind of a sticky issue in some cases, but in most cases, you just can't actually do it. It's just not going to be allowed. They just won't allow it, whereas you can in other industries. But differently too, lawyers have to print things at home. You can't just turn off printers. You can't just turn off USB drives. You can't just turn off all these ports. A lawyer has to go to the courthouse and then move some files to a USB drive to hand to a state's attorney, right? And maybe that needs to be encrypted sometimes. Or they need to print something at home because they need a wet ink signature. They can't always use DocuSign for everything, right? They need to have those capabilities. And sometimes they work late nights or weekends, and they don't want to have to wait around till 9 a.m. for the site administrator to approve something. So culturally, with these technologies, you need to have the ability to control things, but you need to have a lot of granularity. You need to be able to allow things so that you can have those permissions. You can allow people to do those things without essentially pissing off everyone in the law firm, because that will not end well.
Daryl, I'm sure you've probably seen this firsthand, right?
Absolutely. At our firm, we make mandatory encryption of USB keys automatic with software, for instance, just because we deal with so much personal information. And that's the default. But, we first made it mandatory with no exceptions unless you got approval. And that just didn't fly. So now we actually give the attorney or the lawyer the ability to suspend that, but they actually have to put a rationale, and it's recorded that they suspended that because maybe the client has actually asked, look, we can't read your encrypted key. We want this, and we're fine with the risk. So you have to do that. But by default, every time they stick in a USB key, it's going to encrypt it. And we give them the option. And if you don't explain well to your attorneys and lawyers as to why it's needed and really educate them, they're going to reject it. And best laid plans means it's going to be ripped out, even the client asked for it. So it's happened so many times.
One thing I'll add to that is the internet connection. This is
Right.
another thing. A lot of companies can get by with having all these permissions that are basically configurable through having a client talk to the server. One thing that we see a lot in the US is a lot of courtrooms have, they do not allow internet access. So a lot of these rules that we're talking about now, you need to be able to have some of those capabilities without necessarily connecting a computer to the internet. And that comes up quite a bit as well. And that's pretty unique to that industry. You know, other industries don't really have that problem.
Yeah, and I think that's often why there's you see some of these industries with a higher propensity for using portable storage devices, right, like USB drives, and Daryl, you just mentioned that that was something that you had a problem with. Maybe just expand on that a little bit more. I think you said that you'd restricted it completely and that didn't fly. So you've got some kind of user remediation where they can put a justification in place. Is that right?
Yeah, we really have a tool that it's the same tool that enforces encryption. Every time you plug a USB key, it must be encrypted. And we didn't do what we're talking about here today, which is don't make it so restrictive. Otherwise, they will find ways around things, and they did, and they just got frustrated. And so we softened our stance and said, okay, we recognize sometimes there's exceptions to every rule. And we made it self-help as opposed to having to contact our help desk to get that exception. And then we found the adoption was great. There's actually very few exceptions. We were really worried that everyone would just be putting exception in, but the fact that they know it's recorded and logged,
yeah.
I would say less than 0.5% of our USB keys go out the door unencrypted. But that 0.5% was enough to annoy the lawyers that they really revolted. And it's just a valuable lesson learned. Don't make it so restrictive that no one can work or that they get frustrated. It's not going to do anyone any good. They will find a workaround, or worse yet, demand that you rip it out.
And we will cover some of those sort of best practices of how you sort of deploy in the next section. Let me just sort of cover as well, because I think when you're looking at sort of DLP technologies, there's two things to cover. Not all are created equally. One, and we touched on this earlier, right, was the unstructured nature of client data, and it's important that you have a DLP solution that's able to work off of the meta tagging that's been built into your framework. The other is print, right? How can a DLP technology, Chris, maybe explain this, how can a DLP technology control such print-heavy work processes?
Yeah, well, a lot of companies and a lot of industries will just turn off printers entirely. They'll just say, we're not going to allow you to print at home. We'll turn off local printers and other print capabilities, or they only allow certain print servers to be used at work. And, our product can do that too, basically force you to print to certain locations. But printing is unique for many reasons. And the biggest reason that I kind of want to stress is that printing's been a source of vulnerability in the DLP world for a long time. And lawyers know this. The reason is that they're considered savvy people. So your average employee at some company wouldn't know this, but a savvy person knows if they want to steal something from their employer and they have a DLP, that they just print it. They take their laptop home, they plug it in their local printer, and they print it. That will bypass all the visibility that any DLP, including the big names out there, that can provide, right? They plug it in, they print it, and they can get around everything. And the reason why law firms are especially unique in this is that these are usually lawyers that are advising people to do these things, right? So in the nature of employment law, let's say you've got someone that wants to sue their employee and they need to get emails from management as evidence, or they need files to give to their attorney so they can have some sort of complaint, right? Well, the attorney says, hey, don't move it to a USB drive. They can see that. Don't forward the email to your personal email. They can see that. Print it. Take it home, plug in your personal printer. If you don't have a printer, go out there and buy one, plug it in, and then print it. So by default, law firms are loaded with savvy people that know how these things work, because that's just the nature of this industry, right? Being we are, a DLP, and, I said that law firms are sort of a focus of ours, that circumvention does not work with our tool. We can see all of that data that's getting printed no matter where the location is. So with us, that is a big, selling point that we have as far as our tools go with law firms. But from a big standpoint, I guess, to summarize, is that you've got a lot of savvy people in your law firm with those, with the ability to know how these DLP tools work. And also they need to be able to print from home as well. So you don't want to completely shut that off, but you want to have that visibility. So you need to have the best of both worlds. So you need to have a tool that does that.
Got it. Thank you, Chris. Let's round off today's security briefing. We always like to round these off with, some hints and tips and strategies on how to deploy the technology successfully. And we've got Daryl with us today, which is great because Daryl, you've been through these very projects. So maybe Daryl, you could kick us off on this one. I think strategy number one is about involving partners in decisions early, right? Getting stakeholder buy-in.
Absolutely. And your slide is taking all my thunder away. But essentially, I've had to do this at a couple different law firms where I work now. And the first thing is getting the management committee or your board on board, make sure they understand it's a client requirement and making sure that they're sold on it and they understand why it's important. From there, I've typically always got a focus group and actually talked about, okay, so this is the client requirement. Here's the different options that we can monitor and or block. Blocking, I'll get back to in a minute. And then we actually do a pilot, and the pilot and the focus groups are different people because what the focus group might say, yeah, we're okay if you block this and monitor that. But then the pilot might do something, have a very different opinion. So I try to get more of a, more representation from the firm because if you have 20 partners in a room, you're going to have about 25 different opinions. I think you'd all agree with that. So it's good to get more people involved. And the other thing that I always say, and this is true when I did application whitelisting back in the early 2000s, was, put it in monitoring mode first. Don't just try to turn on all the bells and whistle. Turn it on for 3-6 months and track everything, and then slowly lock things down that sort of came out of your focus group, and have the pilot people test that out. And I have to say, we didn't turn on very much at first, but we did turn on exporting PSTs, for instance, out of Outlook, and we don't actually stop them. It actually just pops up a warning saying, "Warning, this is being monitored and tracked." Because we talk about internal people. It's when they're leaving. One of the first things I would want to do is, I'm an IT professional, so it's easy for me to say this, but most will just want to export their Outlook into a PST file and take it with them, and so it's a really easy win. And again, don't be so restricted that they won't take it, and get the buy-in from the partners every step of the way. And again, I've been for 3 different groups: the board, a focus group, and then the pilot group before we rolled out. And by the time you roll it out to all the firm, I would say at least 25, 30 partners already knew what it was. So, and everyone knew that they were involved. So if they had any questions, especially if they wanted to complain, they would go to the partners before me, and they could do a better job of explaining and defending it than I could.
Yeah, that makes sense. Chris, anything to sort of add in terms of, when you're working with clients, how we advise them to approach it?
Yeah, Daryl is very astute, and his experience is obvious when he's talking. So he said to take things slowly, don't turn everything on. And that's absolutely right. And I've seen people that want to do things in a quick fashion and then the slow way. And just because a DLP has some capability or some bell or some whistle or some tool doesn't mean you should turn it on. Maybe you want to, maybe later on, but not early on. Take it very slowly. Like you said, put in report only mode. Don't block things to start out, and just watch and observe and, be intelligent, see where that data is going, and then modify your policies in the report only mode, and then slowly roll them out to a blocking policy, once you get to that point. But you should be very slow and very intentional with it. Another thing too is if your law firm doesn't have a DLP, the first time you roll it out is a lot different than if you already have a DLP and you're switching DLPs. If you already have a DLP and you're switching, it's not that big of a difference because you already have a good idea of what the things are that you're looking for, right? The things you care about. You've kind of gone through that process with the attorneys as far as what needs to be allowed and blocked. That's not so much different. But when you are new to a DLP and you're adding it for the first time, you have to be extra careful. And, as Daryl said, I always say the first 3 or 4 months are the most important for another reason too. And this will be more important at a larger law firm and just any larger company at all. But if there is someone in your company that is doing something nefarious, the last thing you want to do is tell all of them ahead of time, hey, we have this DLP now, and then they stop doing whatever it is they're doing, right? Because there's no DLP on planet Earth that can block everything. For example, you can't stop them from taking a screenshot with their phone, right? But, savvy people that are maybe people working remotely, maybe they're working at 2 law firms and they never quit their other law firm and they're sharing data back and forth. If someone's doing that, you want to see it, you want to find it, and you want to get rid of them. So you can be strategic with that too. And part of that strategy sometimes could be having a very limited number of trusted people that are involved in these rollouts as well. But that also depends on the size of the law firm.
The second sort of tip was, really understanding how teams collaborate. And I think we've covered this. I don't think we need to sort of spend too much time here. It's about, the way that we work has changed, right? From physical meetings and conversations to enterprise messaging, collaboration tools like Teams and Slack, and they do a great job, right? But it creates a very frictionless society for data sharing. And, Daryl, you've made this point, Chris, you've made this point, you can't lock everything down. Right, people will find workarounds. People will find shadow IT. You will upset people. Right, it's not a great experience. But I think there's something to be said for really understanding workflows. Right, understanding how people are using different tools and why are they defaulting to Microsoft Teams for this type of communication and maybe Slack for this type of communication and email for this. Right, and really just getting to grips with that. I'm conscious of our time, so I'm going to move on to the third of our 4 deployment success guides, and the third one is really just conducting an audit, right, and understanding vulnerabilities. And Chris, I think you said this really well earlier, right? It's not necessarily about where the data is stored; it's where those exit points exist, right? And it's do you need to be doing regular scanning of company laptops, right? Not necessarily to find information that shouldn't be there, but maybe just to understand, are people accumulating more and more information locally because they're working from home, right? They've got spotty Wi-Fi connections and they're just saving locally, right? I don't know, Chris, is that something that's a sensible thing, right? To run these sort of audits, to understand where information exists. Chris, and I don't know if Daryl, you actually, if you actually do this.
Yeah, I'll jump in first, I guess. Yeah, and the other thing just keep in mind too is the reason this can be helpful is that law firms, and Daryl kind of talked about this earlier, is that they don't have specific types of data. At a law firm, sensitive data is whatever their client sends them. It could be a video of a deposition. It could be, hand scribbled notes that are used in a courtroom, right? It could be anything. It's literally anything that your clients send you. So, having a tool that's intelligent, you can go in there and find stuff to see if it's sitting somewhere where it shouldn't, is important. And sometimes, they want the ability to say, hey, I want to know where all the documents are that are in relation to this particular client. And you need to be able to make a search to go find that stuff. And if it's on some computers that aren't a part of that case anymore, then you should get them off and make sure that that data is only living on the team of lawyers' computers that are actively working on that case, and it's not just floating around everywhere.
Right, I couldn't agree more. And this just reminds me that you need a much more sophisticated DLP than what you might have needed 5 years ago. It can't just be something that's on your corporate firewall. You need something that's monitoring all this data and doing audits everywhere. And it's really important. Our clients are specifically even asking for this. They're not just saying, do you have a DLP system and it's on your Palo Alto firewall and you click yes. You have to have something that's looking at all your data where it might be and to, where are the escape points, as we've been saying throughout this whole entire discussion. So it's really important. And so this slide resonates with me very well.
Great. So our last sort of success guide, Daryl, I hope you'll appreciate this as much as I do. As a technologist, it pains me to say this, but you're not going to fix this problem with software alone, right? This is a people problem, right? And I think, when we think about data security technologies and how that works with company training, I mean, Darryl, I'll ask you about how you manage sort of security training, but I've worked for so many organizations in the past where we put employees through an hour's worth of training every year and then expect them to record that to muscle memory and bring that back whenever they're using a piece of data. And of course, that's not going to happen, right? So how do you as an organization, I guess the question is, make security part of the culture? so that, the culture is working with technology, right? You're listening to users, you're refining policies, but both of those are working in balance. I mean, Daryl, how does your organization think about, training, for example?
So our training is actually quarterly. It's done by myself. It's a live interactive broadcast that I do via Teams. And, we don't just explain, thou shall not do this, this, and this, and this. We actually explain why it's there and what are the implications and how it could affect our reputation. And, we sometimes even show them like a real RFP from a client where they're asking for this. So they actually, I find that our staff and lawyers understand much better when they understand why we're implementing something, as opposed to we're implementing this technology, you can no longer do X. And I find that that's what most organizations tend to do. So we take painstaking time to explain why and what the consequences are, and actually showing our clients are asking for this. And we get much better buy-in on that. And, we do like monthly phishing testing, everything like that. But I do a quarterly training session, which is live. It's not a boring video. It's always relevant to what's happened last quarter, as opposed to just watching some training video.
Yeah, I can imagine when you're showing RFPs and client requests for this, it probably resonates a little bit more unless it was just yourself with the greatest of respect telling them. So listen, thank you both. That's been an amazing and really interesting chat, and I value you spending half an hour or so with me to talk through this. We do have some questions. I don't think we're going to have time to get through them all. I want to be respectful of time. So if I don't get to your question, please do drop Chris a note, or we will reach out back to you. I'm going to read them out. I've got them down here. They've come through on the Q&A. What about firms that are using Apricorn encrypted USB drives? So these are ready encrypted drives, right? I mean, Chris, I'll throw that over to you because it sounds like a sort of solution specific question.
Yeah, so that's pretty common with law firms. A lot of them like to have those hardware encrypted Aegis or Apricorn drives, or whatever brand you use. With our particular tool, there's no issue with that. We can integrate with those if you want to use those. In some cases, companies don't realize that there is a software encryption tool out there where they don't have to keep inventory on these things and check them out and keep track of them. We could actually do all of that just with software. Some companies know that and others don't. And when they find out they can solve all that with software, that's pretty nice. And, if you want more details on that, we can provide all that. But that would be one way, is just maybe replacement with software, or you can have our platform. In this case, it can require that any USB drive is hardware encrypted in order to be used. So we can actually have the granularity to differentiate between the level of encryption.
Got it. Here's a great question. Actually, what happens if an employee and their laptop goes offline for a week, or a month even? Maybe they're on extended leave or vacation, and how do you ensure that your policies are still being maintained at that point?
Yeah, this happens a lot with lawyers too. So, by design, our particular platform works by having a client server architecture. So the software will talk to the client usually once every 5 minutes, but it's configurable. If someone goes offline, we will not get those reports, but all of the events will still be tracked and logged. So if they try to move something to a USB drive, or they try to do this or that, anything they do will be kept in the client. And then once it does reconnect, maybe it's a week later, a day later at some Starbucks on the Wi-Fi, all of those events will be synced all at once, and then you'll be notified and you'll see all that. So all the DLP policies will still be working. You just won't see those alerts or reports until it reconnects to the internet.
Got it. Daryl, do jump in if you have any sort of views on any of these. Do please jump in. Otherwise, I'll just fire them to Chris. We've had a few questions talking around a similar theme, right? And that's how you start sort of managing sensitive information that's being used out of sort of cloud storage devices. The one that I've got here, one of the three that talks to this. What if you want to block someone from using a personal Dropbox account, but still allow them to use workplace Dropbox accounts? How do you make that distinction?
Yeah, that's a good one. So in our case, you would basically just block file uploads across any virtual exit point location across any browser. if it's a desktop client, that can be differentiated versus a browser. But in this particular case, if you want to allow a work Dropbox, you would allow that, and then, or I'm sorry, you would whitelist that, and then you would block basically just general Dropbox uploads. So if they try to go to regular Dropbox, it'll be blocked. But if you want to have a person or a work one, then we would whitelist that location, and then that would be allowed.
Got it. Darryl, is that something that you sort of see? You've got those sort of workplace, I guess, with things like Teams, you've got SharePoint and OneDrive accounts that your firm owns, and then people have got their own personal accounts, I guess.
Yeah, and it's really important that we block the personal versus the corporate, because obviously Teams and others are so easy to upload information. So it's something we track very closely.
We've got perhaps time for one or two more. Someone was really interested in this whole issue of printing, Chris. What if we need to allow someone one-time access to a printer? Right, I've got a policy to block this or to control it, but people need access at home or in the office on a one-time basis. How's that? How should we think about that?
Yeah, this kind of groups into the general granularity that we were talking about earlier. Yeah, you want a tool that can do that. So maybe by default, you have a global blocking policy, but then someone has a one-off use case. Maybe they're at a hotel traveling for a deposition. They need to print something at a hotel, or they need to do something like that. You need to have a one-off use case. You also need to have a one-off use case capability when you're not connected to the internet as well. They might be in a courtroom. They call you and say, "Hey, this courtroom doesn't allow internet access, but I need to move a file. I need to print a file at this printer, maybe in the courtroom, or maybe it's a hotel." That way, with us, we have something called offline temporary password, where you can generate this one-time use password for an hour or 2 hours or a day, whatever you want to do. You can even do it at a time in the future if you anticipate this might be an issue. And then you can give them that password and they type it into their computer. They never need to talk to the internet in order to use it. And then it will know to go ahead and allow that activity or that policy for that length of time.
Perfect. Well, listen, guys, I think that's it. We're at time. I want to be respectful, certainly, of time. I know all three of us are in. Darryl, you're in Canada. Chris, you're in the US. I'm in the UK. I've lost what everybody's time zone is, but I'm sure you've got other meetings to get to. So I'm going to thank you for your time. It's been fascinating talking to you both. Thank you, everybody, for attending. A recording of today's session will be sent to you in the coming days. If you have any questions, Chris is available on email. His information is there on the screen, or you can find us at endpointprotector.com. Once again, thank you, everybody, and have a great day. I'm going to end the webinar right there.